Hey everybody, it's Rabbit. Welcome to the channel, and today we're going to be doing a very special War Thunder video. This one is going to be about how to properly transport and store classified information. And you might be thinking to yourself, well, the most recent leak of classified information was from a Discord server. But it turns out War Thunder has a bit of a reputation for doing this kind of thing, so we're going to help give you some information to hopefully not go to jail or get serious fines. As a bit of a preface, the information presented here is mostly going to be related to the handling of classified information within the United States. However, most countries do use a similar system because at the end of the day, adding a lot of layers and complexities to these type of systems generates confusion. Generating confusion in turn increases the likelihood of leaks. So the entire point of these systems is to make it easily recognizable who does and doesn't have access to certain information and what information can and cannot be released. If you have any questions about the proper storage and transportation of classified information within your local country, there are definitely authorities you can contact. If you're within the United States, my go-to would be the Defense Intelligence Agency, or DIA. And we're going to start things off with unclassified information. Unclassified is generally represented by green markings. However, a lot of times it's simply not represented at all because it would be very time-consuming to put this on literally everything. It's important to note that unclassified is technically a classification because unclassified does denote that it is property of the United States government. However, an individual doesn't necessarily need specific permissions or clearances in order to see unclassified information. And as a bit of a side note, unclassified should not be confused for open source. Open source is not owned by the US government, whereas unclassified is owned by the US government but is generally releasable to the public. And of course, this gets into a bit of a minor pet peeve of mine. You'll see a lot of movies and video games will depict it as classified. Like, they'll just have a giant classified label. It's like, classified as what? Like, that doesn't tell you anything about how you're supposed to handle the documents or who has access to it. So that's just kind of a dumb trope. Generally speaking, you'll never see a label just called classified on something. And the first category of information that actually does have restrictions on releasability is confidential. Confidential is generally represented by blue markings. Now, one of the major things that differentiate confidential information from higher classifications is that confidential information doesn't necessarily require a clearance in order to access it. It only requires permissions or, like, to borrow a movie trope, need to know. If you're in a position where you need to use that information for your day-to-day job, you can generally get access to confidential information. This also creates the biggest problem with confidential information and is going to, we're going to go into a bit of an explanation in terms of the problem with all classifications of information in general. So secure information has to be accessible in order to be useful. So somebody has to be able to get to it, but also you don't want it to be too accessible so that people that you don't want it getting access to it have access to it. This always creates a fundamental compromise between trying to make sure the information is usable, but also not trying to make sure that anybody can get a hold of it. So at the end of the day, confidential information creates the biggest problem because it is most often used by individuals that don't have a clearance and also may not necessarily have proper training on the handling of classified material. However, this is also why confidential information usually isn't that sensitive to begin with, because confidential information, it's usually just the basics you need to do a day-to-day job. In that respect, confidential information typically isn't that sensitive, and it's engineered to where it's not that big of a problem if it's leaked, although you would still rather not have it get leaked in the first place. And to use a basic example, we'll start out with, an alert roster, which is something you might be familiar with in your military. Alert rosters in the military have the layout of a unit with all of the individuals in that unit, their rank, and their phone number, and this is used for mustering the unit in case of an emergency or giving somebody to contact if they experience a personal emergency. The problem with alert rosters, and this also is something we'll extend over to other classifications of information, no individual piece of information on an alert roster has a classification at all. It's just your name, your phone number, somebody else's name, phone number, etc. However, all of that information put into a single product where you can get the entire layout of the unit, including everybody in it and how to contact them, is confidential. However, you can't give every individual soldier a security clearance. That's just grossly impractical. So things like alert rosters end up being one of the most common types of confidential information to be compromised. And it also kind of demonstrates the problem with confidential information is a bunch of people that don't really have any training need to access it in order to do their day-to-day job. Like, they have to have access to this information, but you can't give them clearance either. So The alert roster problem by itself shows the issue with confidential and why it's the most commonly compromised piece of information. However, an alert roster being compromised isn't that big of a deal. It doesn't compromise national security the same way some other pieces of information could. And of course, jumping off the idea of alert rosters, because nothing individually in there is classified, it's very easy to be confused for that information being unclassified, having no real classification. And this creates the problem is you can't simply assume a document doesn't have a classification because the information looks fairly easy to access. For example, if I were to simply give you my opinion on a situation as an individual, that would be unclassified or technically open source. However, if I were to put that exact same opinion in a top secret government document, that opinion is now top secret, even though it's basically based on the same information. And this is an example of how the same information, depending on how it's formatted, can have wildly different classifications. And next up, we're going to go into both secret and top secret information. Secret is generally represented by red markings. Top secret is generally represented by orange markings. Now, secret and top secret both require clearances, and there is a difference between a secret clearance and a top secret clearance in terms of how involved it is to get that clearance, how expensive it is, how strenuous the criteria are, etc. However, if you have no clearance whatsoever, secret and top secret are effectively the same thing. You shouldn't be seeing that information. Now, to go into a bit of a common trope, there is no classification above top secret. It's important to remember the entire point of classifications is so that anybody who sees that information knows how to handle it and knows who has access to it. So having a classification that is itself classified would completely defeat the point of a classification system. It makes literally no sense. So there is no current classification that is above top secret. However, the concept of things being above top secret does bring up an interesting point about lateral classifications. If you see on a document, especially a declassified one, you'll see the base classification, such as secret, top secret, and then you'll see 2 slashes and then a series of other terms. These do not increase the clearance you need to access it. However, you may need to go through additional steps to get access to those programs to access it. These are generally releasability requirements, though, as mostly they just say you can't give it to people who don't have access to this type of information, or it is specifically releasable to these individuals. So it might not require any special permissions, or it might, it just kind of depends. Now, as we discussed with confidential information, it's handled by a lot of uncleared individuals that don't necessarily have access to secured facilities. Even if they have access, they wouldn't have permissions to actually enter that facility. So confidential storage is pretty lax. However, secret and top secret is very much not. There are specifically accredited facilities. Obviously, top secret accredited facilities and safes require a lot more stringent guidelines. But at the end of the day, these are generally where they're required to be stored long term. For short-term use, you can take materials out of these facilities. However, it must have a cover letter on it. The cover letter is designed to allow people to know what the nature of the information is, at least in terms of its classification, without actually having to see the document itself and potentially glean information they may not have access to. I'm going to spoil this for you right now. A manila folder with a sheet of paper taped to it is definitely not going to stop somebody from accessing that information. So an individual with a clearance should definitely have these papers on them at all times. If you think to yourself, well, what if I have to take a dump? My response is, at least you'll have some good reading material while you do it. Now, when you start looking at some of the documents in War Thunder, the obvious question is, how do you know if something has been declassified or not? The easiest way to tell is to look at the portion markings. If the portion markings have been sanitized, that is to say blacked out, the document is declassified. The entire reason why you go through the process of removing the portion markings is so there's no confusion as to whether or not the information is classified or not, and how to handle that information. However, a lot of older documents, this procedure wasn't really in place, and if you ever have any point of confusion, obviously you should contact an agency before sharing it on the internet. So, always a good idea to check with an expert instead of just assuming that you know. Now, as a side note for declassification, there can be whole classification or partial declassification. Or alternatively, the document can simply be sanitized for release. Now, a document that is sanitized for release has the parts that are not authorized for release blacked out entirely. And you'll notice if we look at the Trump-Zelensky phone call again, some of it is confidential, some of it is secret. So if you only had confidential access and you requested a copy, all of the secret parts would just be blacked out. And the movies like to do this where, there are still words and phrases that are visible. That's not how it works at all. The entire paragraph that is secret would be blacked out if you didn't have access to it, or if it wasn't authorized for release. It's also important to note that if for whatever reason you find yourself needing to dispose of classified information, there are prescribed ways to do it, and you should definitely talk to information security officer or an agency like the DIA for your local country, because it turns out you can't simply throw them in the trash. You're basically just leaving that information on the ground for anybody to find. So make sure that if for some reason you need to dispose of classified information, you consult somebody who can inform you on how to do it correctly. And now we get into the fun part. What happens when classified information gets leaked to the person who leaked it? Broadly speaking, if you steal classified information from the government and leak it, that's straight up espionage, so typically hefty jail time. However, the majority of leaks are internal, not external, and the majority of leaks are accidental, not intentional. So it's important to realize that a lot of these individuals are federal employees, which means that a lot of the actions taken against them will be administrative within that organization, not necessarily criminal, especially if the requisite intent wasn't there. So we're going to start on the lighter end of the punishment spectrum and look at individuals leaking AFV manuals. For example, the Challenger commander leaking part of the Challenger 2 manual. The big thing with these manuals is important to realize, as we discussed with confidential information, you can't afford to give every crew member a clearance. It's simply not practical. It's way too expensive. It's way too time consuming. So at the end of the day, the information within the manual is going to be what the crew needs to do their jobs. It's not going to have things like the test reports on the performance of the armor packages at XYZ angles against certain shells. Like, that's really specific information the crew doesn't really need access to. So the information is kind of kept to the minimum operating standard, the 10 level standard. In that respect, while the punishment for leaking these manuals, it's probably going to be reduction in rank, reduction in pay, might even be some minor break time, but it probably wouldn't be that serious, although it's almost certainly a pretty bad career move. Now, several of the aircraft manuals were also leaked online, and this is a little bit of a different story. Officers in general, it depends on the military, but officers do often have a secret clearance. Pilots in general are also often officers. So these manuals for aircraft and how to operate them could actually have a higher classification than simply confidential. They could have potentially a secret or even top secret. Top secret's unlikely, though, as that's a lot of pilots get TS clearances for. But secret's not completely out of the realm of possibility, so it's very likely that information on, say, the specific radar characteristics of an aircraft would definitely warrant much more significant punishment, up to and including jail time. But now we get into the really bad ones. So first off, we have the individual who leaked the characteristics of the Chinese shell. The shell that we're talking about is an APF SDS, armor-piercing fin-stabilized discarding sabot, currently in use by the Chinese military on, I believe, both their 96 and 99 series tanks. This is the kind of specific test data because it appears to be test data at certain ranges, certain angles, exactly how many millimeters of armor it penetrates. This is the kind of thing you would never see in a tanker manual. This kind of test data just doesn't exist for tankers. This would be used for higher level labs, or if they were trying to create a matrix telling you where you could pen common enemy tanks or something like that. An average tanker wouldn't have access to it. It's likely at least secret, if not top secret, or its equivalent with the People's Republic of China. So yeah, at a bare minimum, you'd probably be looking at some jail time if you leak this in the United States. I imagine the PRC is not any more generous than the US on issues like this. And of course, we have to talk about the elephant room, which was an entire classified briefing that was given to apparently a group of individuals that was leaked online on a Minecraft Discord server. So this hits all the boxes for something that will send you to Fort Leavenworth for a very long time. So you have information that is both A, highly classified, and B, specifically pertains to ongoing operations, and you're also intentionally leaking it, like it's not an accident. The only way this could be worse is if he was also trying to sell it to a foreign power. This is as bad as it gets. There is essentially no defense for his actions. He is definitely going to jail for a long time, no questions asked. And to answer a very common question about this incident, why does a 21-year-old have access to this kind of information? My question is, why wouldn't he? He's in the military, he's just successfully passed the background check for a TS clearance. There's absolutely no reason why he shouldn't have access to information that is required to do his job. I think people really underestimate how young people in the military are and how much responsibility you get even at the age of 21. And that concludes our video. I hope it was informative. I hope it was entertaining. Maybe it keeps somebody from getting arrested for doing something stupid. Who knows? But if you have any questions on classified information in general, you have something you're not sure if it's classified, make sure to contact somebody. Don't just post it online, please. Thank you. Have a nice day, everybody.